Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the philosophy department at California State University, Sacramento, and this is the second lecture on Ian Hacking's book, Introduction to Probability and Inductive Logic. We're working on chapter 3 in Hacking, and we're going to talk about some of the basics of probability theory, gambler's fallacy, bias, independence, dependence, fairness, and so on in this lecture. All right, so let's use some familiar examples to try to understand some of the really important basics. And next to confirmation bias, one of the most pronounced common mistakes that people make in reasoning about probabilities is known as the gambler's fallacy. Vegas, billions of dollars have been made and Vegas has been built on this mistake. And I want you to understand the mistake intuitively, and I also want you to understand it technically. And we're going to introduce a number of technical concepts and principles that should help us define it and explain it exactly right. Okay, so as a rough first approximation, the gambler's fallacy is this. It's the mistake of thinking that the probability of a certain output of a random system increases or decreases when there's a short-term string of wins or losses. That's a way to think about it. Now, let's talk about it different ways. It's the belief that the odds are building up over time to achieve a particular outcome distribution. So imagine somebody's playing a game of chance, or they don't have to be playing a game of chance. They can just be having a string of events in their life, and they go, oh, well, my luck is bound to change. Or I've been rolling this die, or I've been playing this game, I've been losing. It's bound to turn, the odds are improving, or I'm going to do better soon. You know, I used to tell the story. Imagine that you've got a friend who's working on a casino floor and there's a bunch of slot machines there. And you go into the building and your friend says, hey, that slot machine over there in the corner, that one hasn't paid off in 6 weeks. It's due to hit. Okay, so this due to hit notion that somehow the world is pregnant for some event to come out. Probabilistically, that's the mistake. At least it's a mistake when it's applied to the wrong kind of system. So sometimes the odds are building up over time, and there's a dependent probability that's improving, increasing, building up over time, and the universe is pushing for something. There's some causal force there. But the gambler's fallacy is making the mistake of thinking that that causal force or that dependence is happening when it's not, when it's just a dumb piece of plastic that's made of a die, or it's a slot machine that's set to deliver random results, or some other case where it's not due to hit. People often think that dice, roulette, slot machines, or other systems are accumulating a greater chance to win as more losses add up. And they say things like the system's due to hit, or any kind of idea or language that way. So this is partly how casinos make billions, because people who run casinos know that the dice don't remember. I mean, there's that die when it comes up, doesn't come up 6 for 50 times. You roll your die, you roll it again and again and again, and 6 doesn't come up. It's not like the die goes, oh, it's time for me to turn to 6. The thing doesn't remember what it did last. And so memory, thinking about these systems as having memory, and the gambler's fallacy is mistaking an output for having memory that doesn't have any memory. They're independent events. When you're dealing with random, independent games, the past results have no causal impact on future outcomes. Now, I'll give you some examples where they do, but let's get really clear on the difference. Okay, now a related but different mistake is the belief in a hot or cold hand, and this usually happens in sports. When somebody is on a streak and they think that the next output is more likely to be the same as the last. Like in basketball, this happens. People who have been winning have a hard time quitting because they think they're hot when they're gambling or they're shooting baskets or whatever. Specifically, they think that the fact that they have had a series of winning bets means that they will continue to have winning bets. And somebody in the casino says, oh, I'm hot. Right? Think about this case. Imagine we've got a basketball shooter where a 0 represents a miss and an X represents a hit. So now this guy, Larry Bird's making shots, maybe from the free throw line, and misses 3 times, and then he makes 7 baskets. Now, if you were to look at this probability, I think what happened here is so now look at this case. So here's two strings of Larry Bird shooting baskets. Up here is where he missed 3 times and he hit 7 times. Here's where he missed 10 times. So now where my red arrow is pointing are the odds for that making that shot better or worse than they were in the previous case. And people will say weird things here. Now what happened is that Tom Gilovich and a bunch of statisticians analyzed years and years of NBA shot data, and they discovered that there's actually no improvement, there's no accumulation, that the odds of making this one are not any better or any worse than this case. So if Larry Bird's got a 72, or I don't know what a good free throw average is, or a 90 percent free throw average, the odds of making this basket are still 90 if that's his general average, and they are in this case. So they crunched all the numbers and discovered that there's really no such thing as a cold or hot hand here, where somebody is on a streak and they're prone to lose or prone to win. Their average over the long term is just their average, their free throw or their shooting, their hits. Okay, so the hot hand is a different kind of mistake, but you can see how it's related to this idea of the gambler's fallacy, and it has to do with sort of mixing up what's happening in the universe and what's making the probabilities come out the way they come. Okay, so think of it this way. Probabilities are in your head, and odds, we can think about them in the world. So the accumulation of odds mistake is sometimes what people call the law of averages. And in fact, this is a mistake. There's no law here. There's nothing in the universe out there in physics that's pushing that die to produce a certain particular outcome on the 10th roll that makes it have an output dependent on what happened in the previous 9. There's no law here that's forcing that average to happen. So it requires us to sort of frame the way we're thinking about these probabilities differently. And I've got a way to sort of sort that out. So you'll see in a second. So, for example, people who have been cold, move my camera just a little bit, at the tables will often convince themselves that this recent history means the odds have to shift back in their favor at some point. Well, look, the odds of you winning any of these really astronomically unlikely games of chance like the lottery, you playing 30 years the lottery doesn't improve your odds, especially if you were playing, well, we have to think about a couple different ways. Lottery numbers, there's a 1 in 10 million chance or 1 in 100 million chance of you winning the lottery on any given day. Now somebody thinks, oh, well, I'm going to play the same numbers over and over and over again for years and years, and surely the odds, after I've been playing that same set of numbers for 10 years, the odds are that number is going to come up. Well, the way the lottery works, I assume, is that the random number generator here doesn't keep track, and it doesn't eliminate numbers once they've come up. So the fact that a number hasn't come up for years and years doesn't mean that it's due to come up, and there's not a narrowing of the odds here. The odds, if they're 1 in 10 million on the first day, they're 1 in 10 million on the 10 years into this project. And you playing the same numbers or different numbers doesn't have any impact on it at all, and you playing a lot doesn't significantly improve your chances of winning. Or people who've been pulling a slot machine all night and getting no payout often feel that it would be foolish to quit. I don't want to quit now, since the odds are now so much in favor of a jackpot, like it's building up or it's due to hit. Both mistakes are related. Games of chance typically have no memory whatsoever. They don't remember what they did last, and that doesn't causally impact what happens next. Previous outputs don't have any causal impact on future outputs. Formally, the way to think of this is that the trials are independent. Okay, so the gambler's fallacy is mistaking an independent system for a dependent system and then making probability estimates accordingly. Okay, so now a related mistake that's sort of clustered up in the confused way that people think about probabilities and gambling and the like is called confirmation bias. A related mistake we frequently make involves choosing results that we favor. And here's what I mean. Confirmation bias, and this is going to come up again and again in this course, is the mistake of favoring or selecting evidence that supports a favored hypothesis while ignoring or neglecting evidence that would disprove it. Now, this is something that happens in the head, and it's when you go searching for and you cherry pick the evidence that supports this idea you've got, and you neglect or ignore the evidence that would have disproven it. So I'll show you how this applies in a lot of cases, here's one case, I'll show you a gambling case. Imagine that Smith says, oh, I have prescient dreams. And what prescient means is you can see the future with your dreams. You may have had one of these dreams where you had something, you dreamt something the night before, something very vivid even, and then it happened the next day. So Smith says, once I dreamt that my aunt was in danger, and that day her plane crashed. Or, some other case like this. I bet in your family or in your history, there's some family lore here about somebody's having this ability, kind of have an uncanny knack for seeing the future, or having dreams that tell the future, or maybe you had a premonition that told you something was going to happen. Okay, very likely what's going on in cases like that is confirmation bias. Because consider, Jones says in response to Smith, look, let's say you have 5 to 20 dreams a night, every night for 30 years. That's over 200,000 dreams. Now, the vast majority of those are completely unremarkable and they're unmemorable. Nothing special happened, or there wasn't some prescient event happened the next day where it actually lined up. You had some weird dream about you were a moose and you were riding a bicycle. Well, that didn't happen the next day, and you don't remember it because dreams are always weird, and there's always weird. You have lots of them. So what's happened is that you are citing the one surprising example that seemed to come true while you're neglecting 199,999 other dreams. So very often when people, they won't say I have prescient dreams, but when somebody goes, wow, that's so amazing, or that's so surprising, or whatever, well, no, it's probably not, because once you look at the comparison class and you look at the evidence you're neglecting, suddenly the so-called surprise disappears. So this happens in gambling cases too. Gamblers will do this. Jones now asks Smith, how did you do in Vegas last weekend? Smith says, oh, I did great. I was really hot at the craps table. I won $250. Casinos know how human psychology works. In fact, they hire psychologists to design these games to make them push your buttons for confirmation bias. Slot machines, when you do win, will set off, and they'll drop those coins in the tray, and then they'll set off these alarms and lights and make all this fuss. Okay, now that's an adrenaline-filled moment for you. That's an exciting, thrilling event. And when that happens, especially if it happens, even if it happens near you in the casino, it catches your attention, you remember it, it's notable, it's something that's memorable. Okay, so a win is memorable for lots of reasons. It's memorable because there was alarms going off, or people were cheering, or you were excited, or you got a rush of adrenaline. So confirmation bias here is making you focus on that event. And then, of course, when the times you played the slots and you put a quarter in or $1 in and nothing happened, well, nothing happened. And nothing memorable unfolded. So later, when you're recounting your weekend, you don't go, oh, well, yeah, I sat there at the slot machine and I played 120 times, and 119 times out of the 120 times, nothing at all happened. Nobody ever reports that, right? So confirmation bias is this selecting out of the evidence that matters. So now Jones asks the crucial question, okay, Smith, how much money did you lose over the whole trip? Now Smith goes, oh, well, I guess I started with $550. I came home with 25, so actually mostly I lost. But what what Smith remembered was winning $250 at the craps table. That was the most exciting moment of the weekend. So Smith got really worked up about it, and that feels like a big deal, like that really happened. Oh yeah, sure, Smith won $250, but overall, Smith is down $525, or whatever. I'm making up the numbers. But my point is, you don't remember the losses, you remember the wins. So confirmation bias here clouds the way we think about these cases. Now, this happens to you when you're saying, oh, I'm having a bad day, or oh, I'm having a really good day. Well, you're probably committing confirmation bias. So you're going, oh, well, I always get stuck in traffic when I take this way home. Well, you might remember the 2 or 3 cases where you get stuck in traffic, but the other days where you rode home with very little traffic, and it wasn't a big deal, those are not memorable, so they don't stick in your mind and you don't think about them. And also, and I'll use this example in other cases, but lots of racist and sexist examples where somebody goes, oh, well, Asians are really bad drivers, or black people are lazy, or whatever. Like pick whatever sexist or racist stereotype that somebody has, and you've got an uncle or somebody who will say this stuff, and then they'll point it out to you and they'll gloat. They'll go, see, I told you, when they see a bad Asian driver, for example. But of course, what your uncle is not noticing is that same day there were 200 or 300 good Asian drivers that went by him on the freeway. He doesn't notice those because they don't fit with his hypothesis, and confirmation bias doesn't select them out. Those are not very interesting. They don't sort of confirm. And we're engineered by evolution to confirm these pet hypotheses. So we remember the hits and we forget the losses, or in some cases it's the reverse, but there's a selection of evidence here. And then another confounding mistake that happens to us in gambling cases is that we actually know gamblers tend to treat close misses as almost wins. So I used a slot machine example here where this guy almost got 3 sevens. Now, the people who build slot machines know this, and by getting that almost 3 sevens, that feels like an almost win. Now in terms of money, that's a loss. You put your money in, you got nothing back out. But psychologically, the way that feels is, oh, I almost won. I was just almost there. I just need to try one more time. I'll get close, right? I just need to wish a little harder, or rub my lucky rabbit's foot a bit harder, or just keep trying. I'm so close. No, the universe doesn't think you're close at all. The universe is just having these independent events unfold. Although I wonder now, thinking about that, I wonder how. Oh, here's how I bet they do it. That casinos, when the game companies, when they build slot machines, they probably set them up so that when the wheels spin, you can see the one above and one below. So you see the cherry, or you see the 7 that's above or below the one that came up, and just being able to see the line above or below, that's enough for you to look at it and lock on it and think, oh, that was an almost win. That way they can, I think like Nevada State Gaming Commission, they actually require that these games be independent and be random number generators. So it feels like, or we think we have this causal control, or there's this causal effect on the outcomes and all that from our wishing or from our habits or the things we do. But in fact, the thing is the trials are completely independent. So what happens with gamblers is that instead of just feeling that near miss as a loss, they feel like they're winning, and they're close to winning more than they actually do, and that keeps them going longer than they would have otherwise. Okay, so let's talk about independent probabilities. A system is independent if the probability or distribution of the outputs are not affected by previous trials. The outputs are not causally connected. Flipping a coin is independent. You flip it once, you get a result. You flip it again, you get a result. The second result has no connection to the previous result. When I flip it the second time or 10 times, those previous flips don't have any impact on the next flip. Okay, so that's an independent system. If I had flipped 10 heads, so imagine that I flip a coin 10 times and I get 10 heads. Is it due to flip tails? Is tails coming? Is tails pushing through? And this is very hard to for us to get our heads around it. It feels like tails is coming. Do the odds of getting a tail on the 11th flip go up? Does the coin remember, or is tails pushing through in the universe to come out? And the answer here is no. The odds of getting a tail or a head on the 11th flip are still 50-50. It doesn't matter what happened in the previous 10 flips. But that's very hard for our psychologists to deal with. What's going on here is that evolution had to build a system that could survive in the wild, and that it could identify causal patterns very quickly. Because if you get a causal pattern wrong, especially one that's dangerous to you, the consequences could be deadly. So we have a very overactive, very eager causal conjecture module in our brains. We're always trying to find, oh, this must cause this because they came together. And we err on the high side, sort of false positives, is that we find way more, or we think we see, we feel way more causal connections in the world than are actually real. Because in terms of things that are dangerous to us, or things that might nourish us, making those kinds of hasty generalizations, they pay off, right? If you're a little too skittish about threats, that pays off more than you being too casual or too lazy about threats or danger or what have you. So our systems sort of betray us here in thinking that there's a causal pattern that's not there. Now, philosophers used to call this post hoc ergo propter hoc. Way back in the Greeks were thinking about this. And the idea in Latin there is that, well, if something follows if some event follows a previous event, then the previous event must have caused it. Post hoc, it follows, therefore it must have been the cause of, or been the effect of. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is the way we used to think about this. Now we're understanding this in modern psychology terms and in modern evolutionary biology terms, is that your system is wired up to quickly latch onto and identify those kinds of causal connections in the world, because not doing so is a possibly dangerous mistake. Okay, so what about this case? If I pull a king out of a deck of cards, so imagine you got 52 well-shuffled cards, I pull a king out and I set it aside. Okay, so I take it out of the deck. Does the probability of my drawing a king on the next draw go up? Am I likely to get a king on the next draw? And I actually have the wrong answer here. The probability of my drawing a king on the next draw goes down. So previously, that should be no. These are dependent probabilities, but that should be no, not yes. So here's what's going on. In a deck, there's 4 kings. I reach in, I pull one out. Now there's 3 kings. So now there's 3 out of 51 cards left. Before, there were 4 out of 52. Right, so the odds, I have to figure out the math on that, but the odds have gone up slightly, or sorry, they've gone down a little bit because there's fewer kings to get. There are fewer kings in the deck. What about this case? If I draw an ace out of a deck of cards and then I put it back in, does the probability of my drawing an ace on the second draw change? Okay, so I pull an ace out and then I put it back in the deck and I shuffle it, and now I go to draw it out again. Does the probability of my getting an ace the second time change? No, it doesn't change. These are independent probabilities now. The second event has no causal connection to the previous event because I put the ace back in the deck. All right. So that should help clarify the difference between dependent and independent. Okay, here's a really good, really vivid example of a dependent probability case. Maybe you've been up to Washington, Oregon, or Northern California. On average, here's a kind of alarming fact about what's going on with the earthquake zones up there. That fault line that's just off of the Pacific coast there is called the Cascadia subduction zone. And on average, that Cascadia subduction zone under the edge of Washington, Oregon, and California produces a big earthquake every 243 years. And all they did there was just figure out how many earthquakes have happened over the time that they were able to measure. So on average, every 243 years. We are now 321 years into that cycle. So we're, what is that, 70, 80 years overdue. Okay, now before I said, is tails due to hit? No, in the coin flipping case, tails is not due to hit. But does every year that we go by without an earthquake, does that increase the odds that it'll happen the next year? Well, actually, in this case, it does. Because what's happening here is that you've got these subduction zones. You've got this plate that's pushing against California. You've got that Cascadia plate that's pushing against the North America plate. And there's pressure building and building and building and building. And every year it goes by, there's more pressure. And that pressure needs to, the movement needs to shift. It needs to pop. It needs to release the pressure. It's like you're bending a stick. And if you keep bending and bending and bending, is that improving the odds that thing's going to break? Yeah. The more if you back off, it won't. But if you keep pushing, it goes better and better. So time is bending the sticks here. It's pushing them together. So we're now 321 years into the cycle. Every year that an earthquake doesn't happen, that pressure builds. The odds of a Richter scale 9.0 earthquake there in the next 50 years are 1 in 10, according to a source I looked up in the New Yorker. That is to say, earthquake probabilities like this are dependent. They get bigger over time. So it builds up, the earthquake wants to push through, but a tails in a string of heads with a coin doesn't want to push through. Okay, so the gambler's fallacy, going back to the previous mistake, is really hard to shake. So the gambler's fallacy, this mistake of thinking that this random number generator that you're playing cards or dice or roulette or whatever, it's due to hit. You think that the odds are improving over time as you lose and lose and lose, and it's time for you to hit. Okay, so Think about this question. Which of the following strings of 10 coin flips with a fair coin is most likely to occur? So all tails, heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, 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 or all heads? There's supposed to be 10 of those in each case. Okay, so question. Which of these is most likely to occur if I'm about to start flipping a coin, right? So I take this coin, I flip it. Now, which of these is most likely to occur? And the really hard thing to get here, because you look at that and you go, oh, 2 seems like it's most likely to happen. It really feels like 2 is the one that should happen. 1 and 3 are not going to happen, but it seems like 2 should. Okay, but if you think about that for a minute, you realize, wait a minute, if I'm going to predict this ahead of time, 2, the string in 2 is just as weird or just as hard to predict as the string in 1 or the string in 3. The odds are exactly the same. The odds of flipping exactly one of these sequences predicted before you start flipping are the same. They are all equally unlikely. Here's how you figure that out. You multiply 0.5 10 times, and you get 0.00097. The probability of getting either sequence 1, sequence 2, or sequence 3, that exact sequence, is a tiny fraction of a percent. It's very, very unlikely. Think about it this way. In playing poker, a royal flush, if I can remember this right, is a 10, jack, queen, king, ace, in the same suit and same color. Okay, now the odds of getting a royal flush in poker are something like 1 in 625,000. I think I'm remembering this right. Now, what about this string of cards? If I'm going to take a well-shuffled deck of cards and I'm going to draw 5 of them out, what are the odds that I'd get a 2 of spades, a 6 of hearts, a jack of diamonds, a king of hearts, and a 4 of spades? Okay, now that's a trash hand in poker. I just pulled 5 random cards out of the air. It's a trash hand. It wouldn't win you anything in poker. But what are the odds of getting that particular set of 5 cards on a poker draw? The odds of getting that are exactly the same as getting a royal flush. The difference is that we treat royal flushes as important in our game with our rules, and we treat the other one as being a junk hand. But the odds are exactly the same at getting both of those. It's just that we've singled out some to be significant. Okay, so for the tails and heads coin flips, it's the same thing. That the odds of any one of those particular sequences is exactly the same. It's just that we think of 1 or 3 as being more notable here. Now, there's an important distinction I'm going to make in a second to help clarify things. Okay, what is true if you flip a fair coin 10 times is that you'll probably get a mix of heads and tails. You might even get 50-50 heads and tails. So that's true. But the odds of getting those particular sequences in 1, 2, and 3 are all exactly the same. Now, the odds of getting a roughly even mix of heads and tails, that goes up, but that's for a different reason, and I'll explain why. Of all the possible ways 10 flips can go, the majority of 10 flips have mixed outputs of mix of heads and tails. That is, there's only one way to get all tails, and there's only one way to get all heads, but there's lots of ways to get mixed heads and tails. And that might deceive you into thinking that 2 is more likely. But 2 is a particular predicted sequence, a particular specified sequence, and that's just the same as all heads or all tails. Okay, so which of these sequences of 10 flips of a fair coin are least likely to occur? All tails, all heads, or heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails? Which is least likely to occur? Oh, and there's another one. There's a more random one. So heads and tails sort of mixed. Each of these particular sequences predicted ahead of time are equally unlikely to occur. If I flipped a fair coin 10 times and hid the results from you, okay, so here's a different question. In the first case, these are all equally unlikely to occur. Now, here's a new question. If I flipped a fair coin 10 times, and I hid the results from you, but then I said, which of these sequences is the sequence I flipped? Pick the one that I flipped. Which would you choose? All heads, heads, tails kind of mixed, A or B? in this case, you should choose B. Prediction is different than postdiction here. I've already flipped the coin, and if the choice is, well, it's going to be one or the other of these two sequences, and which one did I probably throw? Well, I probably threw a mix, and if I'm only giving you A and B as choices, then B has got to be the more likely case, because A is more unlikely to happen than a mixed sequence, and B is a mixed sequence, so if I've got those choices, I should pick B. But notice it's a very different kind of question than the first one I asked. Okay, so the junky string in these kinds of cases, that seems like a more random string, but look, the universe isn't acting at the general level. There's no connection between previous flips and future flips. The coin toss is the single, local, independent roll of the dice. That's mixing my metaphors, but look, I flip the coin, that's an event by itself, it's over. Or I roll the die, I roll it, I get a result, that's it, it's over. Then the next event, the next flip of a coin or the next roll of a die is a new event that has no connection to the previous events. But notice with earthquakes or with removing cards from decks or eliminating results, or if you're in a round robin, or if you're in not a round robin, but if you're in a competition to win a volleyball tournament and teams get eliminated, any remaining team has now got a better chance of winning than at the outset, because the odds are building that they are closer, they're better, they're more improved for them. Okay, so now consider this question. Is an uninterrupted string of 30 heads more or less likely than a string with a total of 50% heads and 50% tails? Now, I don't mean even HT, HT, HT. I just mean we flip a coin 30 times and it comes out that it has 15 heads and 15 tails total. But I'm not predicting any particular unique sequence. I'm just saying so we're just asking which one's more likely, that I'd get all heads or I would get, all things considered, 15 heads and 15 tails. Now in this case, the answer is definitely the 50-50 string. And here's the important trick here is to see why. And I'll see if I can explain that really clearly. Okay, so look, consider just two tosses of a coin. There are 4 different possible results. We could get heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails, or tails, heads. So there's 4 outcomes. Because the coin is fair, all of these results, these particular sequences, are equally likely. So 25% chance that you get any one of these, adding up to 100% of all of the total possibilities. In particular, heads, heads is no more or less likely than heads, tails. That's 0.25 times 0.25, I mean 0.5 times 0.5, which is 0.25. But notice that 2 of these total ways that these distributions could go have a head and a tail. There's only one way to get 2 heads and one way to get 2 tails. That is, if I was to lump together all the ways to get 50-50 distribution of heads and tails, well, that's half of the possible outcomes here. It's not just 25%, it's 50% of the possible outcomes. The last 2 are ways to get a head and a tail without specifying the particular sequence. That is, half of the possible outcomes have 1 head and 1 tail. So there are more ways to get 50-50 heads and tails than to get heads, heads, or just tails, tails. Think about it this way. Here's a bigger example. The reasoning goes the same for more trials. So for 4 trials or 4 coin tosses, there are 16 possible unique sequences that might unfold, ranging from all heads all the way down to all tails. So there's all 16 of them. Now what's notable here is that there's still only one way to get all heads. 1 out of 16 possible combinations. 1 out of 16 possible ways to get all tails. But there are 6 ways, and I've marked them in red here, there's 6 ways to get 50-50 distribution of heads and tails. So probabilistically then, that means that we've got 6 out of 16 possible ways to get 50-50 heads and tails if we don't specify the particular sequence. But notice that 6 over 16 actually works out to 0.375. So it's still not probable that you'll get 50-50 heads, tails, but it's more probable than getting all heads or all tails. And where probable here means the 0.5 threshold. So what does probable mean? Greater than 50%. So I'm going to be very specific and very clear about this, because sometimes when I ask people about this, they get mixed up. Probable means greater than 50%. And the same for most. What does most mean? Greater than 50%. So when we say most is true or it's probably true, we mean something 50 plus up to 100. So 0.375, that's 3/8. 3/8 of the ways to flip four coins come out to be 50-50 heads and tails. But that's only 3/8, so it's still not probable. It's not greater than 50% that you get heads and tails, but it is the most probable outcome of all the possible ways. If you had to bet on one of these three possible outcomes, all heads, all tails, or 50-50 heads and tails, you should definitely bet on 50-50 heads and tails. There's 75-25 options there too, but those aren't as numerous. Okay, so let's summarize what we've covered so far, and then we'll do another lecture for the second half of this chapter. The gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that the odds in an independent system change or build up over time, making a win or loss more probable as time goes on. And it's usually mistaking an independent system for a dependent system, thinking that the probabilities are dependent when in fact they're independent. The myth of the hot hand is the mistake, often in sports, of believing in winning streaks. And a lot of data seems to undercut the idea that such a thing happens that way. Confirmation bias is the mistake of selecting evidence that supports a favored hypothesis while ignoring or neglecting evidence that would refute it. And we've been talking about independent and dependent probabilities. If the occurrence of event A does not change the probability of event B in a system, then there are independent probabilities. And I've talked about this in terms of causal connections. If the past events have a causal impact on the probability of future events for a system, like the earthquake, then they are dependent probabilities. And probable for us is going to mean anything over 50%. All right. So that's the end of part 1 for Hacking's chapter 3, and we've introduced a bunch of important basics of probability that let us go on and build this out into a full-blown theory.